Think about the world around you for a second. You strike a match and poof, instant flame.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, that old iron gate, in your neighborhood slowly, almost imperceptibly, turns to rust year after year.
Takes forever.
Or consider the silent miracle of photosynthesis happening in leaves compared to the eons it takes for mountains to crumble from weathering.
Huge difference in timescales.
Even in a simple lab, you can see hydrogen peroxide fizzing away in a beaker relatively quickly versus, say, hydrogen and oxygen combining to form water in what feels like zero time flat.
Almost instantaneous.
So, ever wondered why some changes happen in a flash and others just seem to drag on for ages?
Yeah.
Let's dive into the fascinating world of reaction rates and see if we can, unpack what makes reactions speed up or slow down.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together a really interesting set of resources for this deep dive. We're looking at some physical science teaching plans to see how these concepts are explained, delving into detailed explanations of reaction rates and the factors that influence them, examining a study that highlights common misunderstandings people have.
Oh, that's interesting.
And even checking out some examination guidelines from South Africa to see what key understandings are really emphasized there. Our goal, really, is to get to grips with the fundamental principles that govern just how quickly chemical reactions decide to proceed.
Exactly. You see these reactions happening all the time, but what's the underlying mechanism that dictates their pace? Let's get into it.
Well, at its core, reaction rate is simply a measure of how quickly a chemical change occurs.
Okay.
Think of it as tracking how fast your starting ingredients, the reactants, are being used up to create something new, the products. It's all about the speed of transformation, really.
Okay, so it's like watching fruit ripen on a counter. The reaction rate is how quickly it goes from firm to ripe, or maybe even overripe.
Yeah, exactly like that.
So how do we actually put a number on this speed?
Well, we use some fundamental formulas to calculate what we call the average reaction rate. If we're focusing on a reactant, the average rate is the amount of that reactant that disappears over a certain period of time.
Right.
Specifically, we often measure this in terms of the number of moles of the reactant used up divided by the time it takes for the reaction to occur, usually in seconds.
Moles per second. Okay. That gives us a way to compare different reactions directly.
Exactly.
And what about the stuff that's being created, the products?
It's a very similar idea. If we're tracking a product, the average reaction rate is the number of moles of that product that are formed, divided by the reaction time in seconds.
Okay.
So again, moles per second, but this time it's measuring how fast the product is actually appearing.
You mentioned a real-world example to help sort of solidify this.
Yeah, let's consider the reaction between lithium, which is a solid metal, and oxygen gas in the air. They form lithium oxide, a powdery white compound. The balanced equation is 4-less plus OGG 2-less. Now imagine we do this reaction and find that over, say, 2 minutes, 4 grams of lithium have reacted.
Right.
To calculate the rate at which the lithium is being used up, first we need to convert those 4 grams into moles. For the lithium, that's approximately 0.58 moles.
Mm-hmm.
Then we convert the 2 minutes into seconds, which is easy, 120 seconds.
Yep.
Finally, we divide the moles of lithium used, 0.58 mole by the time 120s. And that gives us an average reaction rate of about 0.0005 moles per second. That's molysio.
Molesy, okay. So in that specific scenario, the lithium is vanishing at a rate of 5,000ths of a mole every single second. That really puts a tangible number on it.
It does, doesn't it?
Our sources also included a table, I think, with various reactions and their rates.
Yes, that table provided data for several different reactions, showing the amount of reactant consumed and the time taken. And by performing that same simple calculation, moles divided by time for each one, we can directly compare their speeds.
And what stood out there? Was there a fast one?
Oh yeah. What stood out was reaction 5. A significant amount of reactant, 5.9 moles, was used up in a really short time, just 30 seconds.
Wow.
That gave us the fastest rate in that table, at 0.2 moles per second. Molus. Quite a difference from our lithium example.
Definitely highlights that some reactions are just inherently much, much faster than others.
Yeah.
We also looked at an example of a much slower process, right? The seemingly endless rusting of iron.
Exactly, rusting. The reaction of iron, which we can represent with the simplified equation 4Fs plus 3ODS, is a prime example of a really sluggish reaction.
Yeah.
If we consider a scenario where maybe 2 grams of iron react with 0.57 grams of oxygen over a period of 30 minutes, and we do the same mole and time conversions, we find that the average rates of reaction are incredibly small.
Like really small.
Tiny. For the iron being used, it's around 1.99 by 1001 moles per second. And for the oxygen, it's about 9.89 by 10 millimoles per second.
Whoa, look at those negative exponents.
Yeah, notice those negative exponents. We're talking about fractions of a fraction of a mole reacting every second. Very, very slow.
Really puts the speed difference between something like, I don't know, burning and rusting into stark contrast. So while moles per second is a key way to express reaction rate, it's not the only way, is it?
That's right. Depending on the context and, frankly, what's easiest to measure, we can express reaction rate in other units too.
Like what?
Well, for reactions happening in solutions, we often talk about the change in concentration of a reactant or product over time.
Ah, concentration. Moles per volume.
Exactly. Concentration is typically measured in moles per cubic decimeter, mole dme. Now imagine a small cube, 10 centimeters on each side, that's your cubic decimeter. So a rate expressed in moles per cubic decimeter per second tells us how quickly the number of moles within that specific volume of solution is changing.
Okay, that makes sense for liquids. What about gases?
For reactions involving gases, we might track the change in pressure over time, or, in some situations, just monitoring changes in mass or volume of reactants or products per unit time can also give us a useful measure of the reaction rate. It depends on the reaction.
Okay, so we've got a handle on how we measure the speed of a reaction. Now for the big question, why do some reactions zoom along while others just crawl? Our sources introduce something called collision theory. Okay, let's dive into this. What's the core idea?
Collision theory is, it's a really fundamental concept. It provides an explanation right down at the molecular level for why reactions happen at different rates.
Okay.
The basic idea is that for a chemical reaction to occur, the reacting particles, whether they're atoms, molecules, ions, whatever, they must first collide with each other.
Seems pretty straightforward.
It seems intuitive, right? The players have to meet to interact.
But just bumping into each other isn't enough to cause a reaction, is it? The theory goes a bit deeper than that.
Precisely. That's the key. Not every single collision between reactant particles results in a chemical transformation. In fact, usually only a small fraction of the total number of collisions that occur are actually successful in leading to the formation of products.
Okay.
We call these successful collisions or sometimes effective collisions.
So what's the secret sauce? What turns a regular molecular bump into a reaction causing an effective collision?
There are two crucial criteria that have to be met. First, the colliding particles must possess a minimum amount of kinetic energy at the moment of impact.
Energy, okay.
This minimum energy needed to get things started, basically to break existing bonds, is known as the activation energy. Think of it like needing a certain amount of oomph to get the reaction going.
Right, like trying to push a heavy box, you need to put in a certain amount of energy just to get it moving. What's the second requirement?
The second vital factor is the orientation of the colliding particles. They need to bump into each other in a very specific way.
How they hit matters.
Exactly. So that the parts of the molecules that need to interact directly actually come into contact. This correct orientation allows the necessary bonds to break and new bonds to form, leading to the products.
Orientation matters. That makes perfect sense. It's like trying to fit two puzzle pieces together. They might collide a million times, but they only connect if they're facing the right way relative to each other.
Yep.
Our sources even had a simple analogy about trying to link arms with someone.
Exactly. That's a good one. Imagine trying to link your right arm with someone else's left arm. If you approach them from behind or try to link your right arm with their right arm, it's just not going to work no matter how much, energy you have to move.
Right.
Molecules are similar. They need to approach each other in a very specific orientation for the reactive parts to connect properly and the reaction to actually happen.
Okay, so collision theory explains the how of reactions at a particle level they need to bump with enough energy and in the right way. Now, let's zoom back out to the macroscopic world. What are the big knobs we can turn to actually speed up or slow down a reaction? Our sources mention several key factors.
There are indeed 5 primary factors that significantly influence the rate of a chemical reaction. First, the inherent nature of the reacting substances themselves.
Okay.
Second, the surface area of any solid reactants involved. Third, the concentration of the reactants or the pressure if we're dealing with gases. Fourth is the temperature of the reaction mixture. And fifth, the presence or absence of a catalyst.
Right. Let's tackle these one by one. Nature of reactants, that sounds a bit general. What exactly does that encompass?
Essentially, it just comes down to the intrinsic reactivity of the substances involved. Some chemicals are just, well, naturally more inclined to undergo transformations than others.
So some are just more reactive.
Pretty much. For instance, sodium, a highly reactive metal, will react, quite explosively with water.
Right. Whereas gold, a very unreactive metal, will just sit there unchanged under the same conditions.
Yeah.
It's about the inherent willingness, if you like, of a substance to participate in a chemical reaction.
Okay, some substances are just born to be wild in the reaction world, while others are more laid back. Got it. Next up, surface area. This seems particularly important when we have solid reactants.
Absolutely. For reactions that involve solids, increasing the surface area of that solid can dramatically increase the reaction rate.
How so?
Think about a large chunk of a solid material versus the same amount of that material broken down into smaller pieces or even ground into a fine powder.
Yeah.
The powder has a vastly greater total surface area exposed to the other reactants.
And why does having more surface area lead to a faster reaction? What's the collision theory link?
Because chemical reactions, especially with solids, typically occur at the interface, right? At the boundary between the reacting substances.
Makes sense. When you increase the surface area of a solid, you're essentially exposing more of its particles directly to the other reactants, whether they're in a liquid or gas. This leads to a greater frequency of collisions between the reactant particles.
More chances to hit.
Exactly. More chances to hit, and therefore a higher probability of effective collisions and a faster overall reaction rate.
Our sources use the example of marble chips reacting with hydrochloric acid. Can you elaborate on that one?
Certainly. Marble is mostly calcium carbonate caco-solid. When it reacts with hydrochloric acid, HCl aqueous, the equation is Caco plus 2HCl aqu plus HO plus COG. You make carbon dioxide gas.
Okay, bubbles.
Yeah, bubbles. If you use finely powdered marble instead of larger marble chips, you'll observe a much more vigorous production of those Charicot bubbles.
Because the acid can get at more of the marble at once.
Precisely. The acid can interact with many, many more calcium carbonate particles simultaneously when the marble is powdered, simply thanks to that massively increased surface area.
We also saw a mention of a video demonstrating fuel burning faster when spread thinly. That's a really vivid visual.
Yeah, that illustrates it well.
And even effervescent tablets dissolving much quicker when you crush them up first. It all boils down to more contact points, right? More surface for the reaction to happen on.
Precisely. These everyday examples perfectly illustrate the principle. By spreading fuel out, you're maximizing its contact with oxygen in the air, leading to faster combustion. Similarly, a crushed effervescent tablet has a much larger surface area in direct contact with the water, allowing the reaction that produces the bubbles to occur much more rapidly.
Interestingly, our sources pointed out that this increased surface area can even be hazardous in certain situations, with examples like flour mills and coal mines. That was quite surprising.
It is a critical safety consideration, absolutely. When normally combustible solids like flour or coal dust are ground into extremely fine particles, their total surface area becomes enormous. If these tiny particles get suspended in the air, a small spark can ignite a very rapid and widespread reaction with the oxygen in the air, leading to a devastating explosion.
Wow.
Yeah, it really underscores the importance of proper ventilation and dust control in industries that handle these finely divided materials.
Definitely a powerful and slightly unsettling example of the impact of surface area. Okay, let's move on to concentration and pressure for gases. As you said, they have a similar effect.
Exactly. Increasing the concentration of reactants in a solution generally results in a faster reaction rate. It's pretty direct.
Okay.
And for gaseous reactants, increasing the pressure effectively does the same thing. It increases the concentration of gas molecules within a given volume, leading to the same outcome, a faster reaction.
And the reason behind this is simply more frequent collisions between the reactant particles. More stuff packed together means more bumps.
Precisely. When you have a higher concentration of reactant molecules in a given space, or a higher pressure forcing gas molecules closer together, the likelihood of those molecules encountering each other just increases dramatically.
Right.
More frequent collisions mean more opportunities for effective collisions, those with enough energy and the right orientation to occur. and thus a faster overall rate of reaction.
Our sources described an experiment involving magnesium ribbon and hydrochloric acid at different concentrations. What did that demonstrate?
Ah, yes, that's a classic one. The experiment compared the reaction between a strip of magnesium metal and hydrochloric acid at two different dilutions, one more concentrated than the other.
And the reaction is?
The chemical equation is 2HCl plus MEgOC plus HEO. You produce hydrogen gas.
Okay, more bubbles.
More bubbles.
Right.
The observation was very clear. The production of hydrogen gas, which you can see as fizzing, was significantly faster in the more concentrated hydrochloric acid solution.
So direct proof.
Exactly. It directly supports the idea that a higher concentration of reactants leads to a faster reaction rate purely because of the increased frequency of collisions.
We also touched on the effervescent tablet experiment again, this time with water at different temperatures. It was noted that the faster gas production at higher temperatures could also be partly attributed to increased particle movement and more frequent collisions.
Correct. While the primary impact of temperature is really on the energy of the particles, which we'll get to next.
Okay.
Higher temperatures also cause particles to just move around more rapidly. This increased movement naturally leads to more frequent collisions, which also contributes to the overall increase in reaction rate alongside the energy factor.
Right. So speaking of temperature, that's the fourth key factor.
Yeah.
We all have a general sense that things tend to react faster when they're warmer, right? Like food spoiling.
Exactly.
What's the explanation for this from a collision theory perspective?
Well, increasing the temperature of a reaction mixture has a profound effect on the kinetic energy of the particles. It increases the average kinetic energy.
So they're moving faster, on average.
Yes, meaning the particles are moving faster. This has two main consequences. First, as we just mentioned, they collide more frequently. Okay, that's part of it.
Oh, there's more.
But more importantly, a much larger proportion of these faster-moving particles will now possess sufficient kinetic energy to meet or even exceed that activation energy barrier we talked about earlier.
So it's not just about more collisions, but more energetic collisions that are actually likely to result in a reaction. The ones that have enough oomph.
Exactly. That's the bigger effect of temperature. Think back to our analogy of rolling a ball up a hill representing the activation energy. At a higher temperature, more of your energy balls rolling towards the hill will have enough initial push to actually make it over the top and result in a reaction down the other side.
That makes sense.
Our sources use everyday examples like, as you said, milk spoiling faster at room temperature versus in the refrigerator.
Yeah, keep it cold.
And fruits ripening more quickly in the summer heat to illustrate this principle in action. Very common observations.
And the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution curve was mentioned in our sources in the context of temperature. What does that graph show us?
The Maxwell-Boltzmann curve. It's a graphical way to represent the range of kinetic energies possessed by the particles in a sample at a specific temperature.
Okay.
What the curve shows is that at higher temperatures, the peak of the curve shifts toward higher kinetic energies. And importantly, the curve also broadens out to the right. Meaning that at a higher temperature, a significantly greater fraction of the total particles have kinetic energy equal to or greater than the activation energy needed for the reaction.
So more particles are over that energy threshold.
Exactly. That shaded area under the curve beyond the activation energy gets much bigger, and this directly translates to more effective collisions per second and a faster overall reaction rate.
Okay, so higher temperature equals more energy, which leads to more effective collisions and a faster reaction. Got it. Finally, we have catalysts. These are the substances that seem to magically speed up reactions without being used up themselves. How do they pull off this trick?
Catalysts are fascinating. They are substances that increase the rate of a chemical reaction without undergoing any permanent chemical change themselves. They emerge unchanged at the end.
So how do they work then?
They work by providing an alternative reaction pathway, basically, a different sequence of steps for the reaction to follow that has a lower activation energy compared to the original uncatalyzed reaction.
A shortcut, or like finding an easier path over the mountain. So the energy hurdle that the colliding molecules need to overcome is smaller.
Precisely. By lowering that activation energy barrier, a catalyst makes it much easier for a greater proportion of the colliding reactant particles, even at the same temperature, to possess enough energy to have an effective collision and form products.
So more collisions become successful.
Exactly, and this can lead to a really dramatic increase in the reaction rate.
Our sources mentioned the classic example of hydrogen peroxide decomposing. It's usually slow, right?
Yes, the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide, the equation is 2HOO plus OG, is a relatively slow process on its own.
but add a catalyst.
Exactly. When you add a small amount of manganese dioxide, which acts as an inorganic catalyst, or you introduce yeast, which contains the enzyme catalase, a biological catalyst, you'll see a rapid, sometimes quite vigorous production of oxygen gas bubbles. The catalyst provides that alternative pathway with a lower energy barrier, allowing the decomposition to proceed much, much more quickly.
And the crucial thing to remember about catalysts is that they don't change the overall energy difference between the reactants and products, right? And they don't affect the final equilibrium position of a reversible reaction.
That's absolutely correct. Those are key points. Catalysts only influence the rate at which a reaction reaches equilibrium. They speed up both the forward and the reverse reactions equally.
So you just get there faster.
Exactly. Therefore, the position of the equilibrium, the relative amounts of reactants and products you have once things settle down, remains unchanged. The catalyst just helps the system get to that equilibrium state much, much faster.
Like catalytic converters in cars you mentioned.
Perfect example. They use precious metals like platinum and palladium to speed up the conversion of harmful exhaust gases like carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides into less harmful substances like co-uro and nitrogen gas. Helps us reach a cleaner output much quicker before the exhaust leaves the car.
Okay. So, we've covered how we define and measure reaction rate, the fundamental principles of collision theory, and the 5 key factors that influence how fast reactions go. Nature of reactants, surface area, concentration pressure, temperature, and catalysts. It seems like a pretty coherent set of ideas.
It generally hangs together well, yes.
But our sources also highlighted some common misconceptions in this area. Why is it important to address these? Why do they matter?
Well, understanding these common misunderstandings is vital because they can really prevent someone from developing a solid, accurate grasp of chemical kinetics.
How so?
If you have a flawed understanding of a basic principle, it can lead to misinterpretations of experimental results, incorrect predictions about how reactions will behave under different conditions. Just throws everything off.
Right. What were some of the main misconceptions that this study identified?
One really common one is the idea that if you increase the concentration of reactants, the reaction will somehow take longer because there are so many more particles that need to collide.
I can see how someone might think that.
Yeah, it sounds plausible on the surface,
Yeah.
but as we've discussed, the opposite is true. More particles in the same volume lead to more frequent collisions and therefore a faster reaction rate. It's about the frequency, the probability of those successful energy-rich collisions happening.
Okay, so more particles doesn't mean more waiting time, it means more action. What was another common one?
Another misconception involves judging the speed of a reaction solely based on the highest temperature it reaches at any single point, without considering, how long it stays at that temperature or other influencing factors.
So a quick burst of high heat doesn't automatically translate to the quickest overall reaction. You need to look at the whole picture.
Precisely. A brief spike in temperature doesn't necessarily mean the overall reaction, averaged over time, was the fastest.
Okay.
Any others? And there was also some confusion noted around the impact of temperature increases on exothermic reactions, specifically how they affect the rates of the forward and reverse reactions in the context of chemical equilibrium.
That sounds a bit more complex.
It dips into equilibrium concepts, but basically, while increasing temperature in an exothermic reaction does eventually shift the equilibrium position towards the reactants, the Le Chatelier's principle,
Right.
the initial effect of raising the temperature is generally to increase the rates of both the forward and the reverse reactions, because more particles have enough energy for both directions. The shift in equilibrium is a consequence of how those rates change relative to each other. It's a subtle point that can cause confusion.
It's interesting to consider where these misunderstandings might originate. Our sources mention things like information on the internet, maybe how teachers present the material, even how concepts might be portrayed in textbooks.
Absolutely.
And of course, just our own everyday observations, which might not tell the whole story.
Exactly. The study emphasizes that misconceptions can arise from various sources. Sometimes simplified explanations, while intended to make the concepts more accessible, can inadvertently lead to these misunderstandings if the nuances aren't fully captured. And everyday observations, while often helpful starting points, can also be misleading if not analyzed carefully through the lens of the underlying scientific principles. For instance, you might observe that a large log takes longer to burn than small twigs, and incorrectly attribute this solely to the amount of wood without fully appreciating the massive difference in surface area available for reaction with oxygen.
Ah, surface area again.
Well,
The study really stressed the importance of understanding what's happening at the submicroscopic level,
yeah.
with the individual particles, the atoms and molecules, to truly grasp reaction rates. Why is that so crucial?
Because at its heart, chemical kinetics, reaction rates, it's all about the behavior of these incredibly tiny atoms and molecules. What we see on the macroscopic level, like the bubbling of a gas or color change, these are just the outward signs, the indirect evidence of these submicroscopic interactions.
And the equations.
Similarly, chemical equations are symbolic representations of these interactions. To truly understand why a reaction occurs at a specific rate and how different factors influence that rate, you really need to visualize those collisions, the energy requirements, the specific orientations of the reacting particles.
Having that mental model.
Exactly. Without this mental model of the submicroscopic world, it's much easier for incomplete or incorrect understandings, these misconceptions, to take hold and persist.
Okay, this has been a really insightful deep dive into the world of reaction rates. Let's try and summarize the key takeaways for our listener.
Sure, I think the fundamental points to remember are that reaction rate quantifies the speed of a chemical change, how fast reactants turn into products. Collision theory provides the why and how at the particle level. Particles must collide with enough energy, aggregation energy, and the right orientation.
Right. And the speed is controlled by...
And the rate of a reaction is significantly influenced by 5 main things: the inherent nature of the reactants themselves, the surface area of any solids involved, the concentration of reactants or pressure for gases, the temperature of the system, and whether or not a catalyst is present.
And all of those factors boil down to affecting collisions.
Essentially, yes. All these factors ultimately affect either the frequency or the effectiveness or sometimes both of the collisions between the reacting particles.
So whether it's the incredibly slow tarnishing of silver or the rapid explosion of fireworks, the same fundamental principles of collision and energy are at play.
That's the core idea.
And hopefully our listener now has a much clearer understanding of what governs these chemical transformations and how we can influence their speed, whether it's in a laboratory setting or just noticing things in the everyday world around us.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, maybe think about all the chemical reactions constantly happening around you right now, from the seemingly mundane, like, I don't know, paint drying.
Or concrete setting.
Or concrete setting, exactly, to the truly spectacular, like a geyser erupting maybe. Or, well, how might the principles we've discussed be influencing something as simple as the digestion of your last meal? That's all enzyme catalysis and temperature effects.
Right, or the intricate chemical processes constantly running inside a living cell.
Exactly. What other everyday phenomena that you might have taken for granted could actually be explained by these fundamental ideas of molecular collisions and energy transfer? It's kind of everywhere once you start looking.
Definitely some fascinating things to ponder. If this deep dive into reaction rates has sparked your curiosity, there's truly a vast and intricate world of chemical kinetics waiting to be explored further.
Oh, absolutely. We've only scratched the surface.
What other subtle factors might play a role in influencing reaction pathways? What are the more advanced mathematical models that scientists use to describe and predict reaction rates with even greater precision? Perhaps those are topics for future deep dives. Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive.